All right, good morning. We want to welcome everyone, our agents, to our in-service training this morning on our specialty crops. This morning, we've got Dr. David Lockwood talking to us about what you see on your screen, tree nuts, persimmons, pawpaws, pomegranates, other tree nuts. We appreciate his time in putting this together. For the agents, this is the fourth and final one in this series that we've been doing since about the second week of November on some topics. We've looked at hops, we've looked at some of the vegetable crops. We looked at berries back in December, and this is the one on tree nuts that we're be conducting here this morning. Again, Dr. David Lockwood is with us. We have recorded each of these sessions. I've had interest from several agents to email wanting to know when we will get those out. After this session is done this morning, we get everything fixed up. We'll have all these on probably our CPA website under our specialty crop section. Once we have that ready, I'll let you know so you can go back and look at any of the four recordings that we will have there for you. So thank you for being with us this morning. Before we get underway with Dr. Lockwood's presentation, I think we have Debbie Ball with us from TDA. She has allowed us what we're working with this training and with some of the in-person workshops that we have coming up, funding from a specialty crop block grant with TDA. So Debbie, I think I've seen you on. If you want to have a few minutes to share with us, we appreciate you being here and support you give us as well for these projects.
Well, good morning, everybody. I think I turned my camera on, but I don't see myself. So
yeah, you're on. You're on.
I am. Okay. Yes. Well, this is really weird because I can't see what I look like, but I'll be quick. I see a lot of familiar names on the participant list, and I love jumping in on these specialty crop block grant projects whenever possible. Just wanted to potential projects for 2022, just reach out to me directly, and I'll be glad to discuss it with you. I'm not going to be able to stay on the whole time this morning, and I kind of hate that, Dr. Lockwood, because I always learn something when I listen to you give a presentation. But you guys have a good meeting.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you again for being with us. She's been able to be on some of the, not all of them, but I think 3 out of the 4 she's been able to be with us. And again, we appreciate her support and the support through TDA for allowing us to do this as well. Dr. Lockwood, we'll turn to you and agents as well. If you have questions, you can hold those to the end. If you want to put some in the chat box, feel free to do that as well. And Dr. Lockwood, we'll hand it to you and let you drive us through this. Thank you again for your time and your work on this with us also.
Well, thank you, Troy. It's good to be here. And Debbie, it's good to see you. Look forward to seeing you at Pitt, Tennessee. So today we're going to talk a little bit about several different tree nuts, primarily pecan, and we'll also touch bases with persimmons, pawpaw, and pomegranates.
Dr. Lockwood, you just went muted on us.
I don't know how that happened.
There you go. You're back.
But anyhow, as most of you know, I'm from upstate New York. I never saw a pecan until I started University of Georgia in 1967, and I actually did my PhD work in pecan. So it's kind of a near and dear crop to me, and we'll lead off with that. Pecan. I'm having some issues here with this thing wanting to advance from. Okay, first thing I wanted to do is just mention some of the nurseries. And one of the big problems we have in pecans is trying to find trees. Over the years, one of the better sources we had was Nolan River Nut Tree Nursery up in Kentucky. But this past winter, or this past year, the person that ran that passed away. And it's my understanding that that is not being continued. So that source is off the list. With that being said, there are more nurseries that might offer some of these trees. I just listed those that I've had a little bit of experience. The closest one to us, of course, is Rockbridge Trees in Bethpage, Tennessee. And they're doing a pretty good job and have a fairly good selection of trees. But if you want to look at pecan and possibly other fruits, Womack Nursery in Texas has been one that we've worked with a fair amount, and they've got some pretty good stuff. Texas Pecan Nursery focuses more on pecans, as you would suspect. So those are some sources. Like I said, there are some others around, but I've not had a whole lot of experience with those. Okay, first thing I wanted to do is talk a little bit about varieties. Now, with pecan, Tennessee is in the Mississippi River Valley is kind of a native home to pecan. But as we move north, we're looking at different varieties than what you might find as you go to the main pecan producing states of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, so on. And so I've listed some of the northern varieties on this particular slide. These varieties have been out there for a long time. And what we're looking at with pecan is realize that the growing season on pecan is it's a little bit tricky when you start thinking about it. Notice that I've looked at nut maturity as 165 days. That's from bloom until nut maturity. I generally recommend that we don't go over 180 to 185 days, simply because we may not have enough time to mature the nuts on the tree every year. And if you look at our growing season, it's kind of hard to figure that out, but realize that pecan is one of the last of our crops to bloom, and they don't necessarily bloom until up in June. And so what we're saying with nut maturity is the time from bloom and fruit set all the way up to maturity. We don't want to go with some of these longer day varieties simply because we can't mature them. For example, one of the more popular varieties further south is Desirable or the Old Stewart. I don't recommend either of those up here simply because, well, partly because they're not going to mature the crop in some years. There are some other factors too. But these northern varieties have been grown in Tennessee for quite some time. There was a grower in Woodland Mills in Obion County that had most of these for several years and did quite well. And so those are varieties that we could look at in our northern fringe. There are some newer ones come down the road that we're looking at, and it's on this chart. Lakota, Caddo, and Kansas are relatively new, as are Nakano and Oconee. And so we're looking at some new varieties. With all the pecan varieties that we're looking to grow in the East, one of the priorities we have, in addition to the time of maturity, is scab resistance. Scab is a disease that can really cause problems in pecan. And unlike scab, say in apple, where it's primarily considered a spring disease, pecan varieties are susceptible to scab infection all through the summer months. And because you've got that long of a potential infection period, and because you got such a big tree, spraying is a very difficult. Most of our growers are not set up to properly spray trees as big as pecan. We look at resistance as a must for varieties that we grow in Tennessee. So all of the varieties that we're listing here have some scab resistance, but realize that resistance does not mean immunity. So scabbing can be still an issue. Another thing that we point out on all these slides, you notice that we talk about under pollen shed type 1 and type 2, and we'll hit that just a bit. But what we talk about protandry and protogeny in pecans, and protandus or type 1 variety is one that sheds its pollen early, whereas a protogynous or type 2 variety sheds its pollen late. And so pecans need to be cross-pollinated. And so we need to have multiple varieties in the planting. We need to have a variety that will shed its pollen at a time that the female flowers on another variety are receptive. And so knowledge of protandry and protogeny can help us make those choices, but it's not enough in and of itself to select a pollinator variety. We need to know a little bit about the specifics within that pollen shed period. Is it earlier than most protandrous varieties, or is it later? You know, and then match up the varieties. So when we look at the types of or the varieties that we're recommending, we want to be aware of the pollination aspect of that variety. Can it fit in well with others? And then on the variety itself, we're looking at yield. How many nuts does it take to make a pound? The bigger the nut, the bigger the kernel, of course, the more desirable that variety is as a rule. So number of nuts per pound, and this is in shell, and what percent of that nut is kernel? What's the fill on it? The bigger the fill, like you notice that Mandan has got 62% kernel fill. That's a very desirable nut from that standpoint. We want to have big nuts, big kernel fill, and then we'll look at, of course, nut maturity as well. We want to have high producing varieties simply because the name of the game is how many pounds of pecans can you make per acre. So this is another variety. And then there are some new ones coming down the road that are being looked at. The gentleman that was my major professor at the University of Georgia has released about 8 varieties of pecan so far. And some of those are very exciting. Bird, for example, is one of his. Morel is one of his. Ellis is one of his. But again, we're looking at the aspects of these pecans and wanting to see whether or not they may fit into the growing conditions that we have in Tennessee. With a pecan, you can plant a pecan nut and under the proper conditions. If you stratify it, plant it in the fall, and the winter will give you stratification or exposure to a cold, moist environment, and that seed will germinate and grow out in the spring. If you leave that seedling tree, it will eventually get up to the point where it'll start to blossom or and put out male and female flower parts. And if you've got pollination, it will crop. But realize that if you grow a pecan from a seedling, there's a lot of variability because of cross-pollination. Chances are you're not, if you grow a seedling tree out, the nuts that it produces may not resemble those of the parent tree where you harvested the nut to start that tree with. Also, a seedling tree takes a long time before it'll ever start to bear a crop. And we're talking here as much as 12 or 14 years in some cases. And quite often a seedling pecan tends to be quite small. They may be a fairly thick shell, but that's variable. I will say that the quality of many of the seedling pecans that I've tried has been very high, but again, it's variable. So we recommend, if you're going to grow pecans for the nut crop, that we use grafted trees. We select grafted trees for several reasons. First off, if you propagate from a tree vegetatively, essentially you're fairly confident that the tree you graft, once it starts to bear, will be identical to the parent tree. So they're true to type. Grafting also makes the tree bear a lot earlier. It'll take a grafted tree somewhere around half the time that it'll take a seedling tree before it'll start to bear a crop. And of course, time is money, and you need to get that field paying back as soon as you can. So the grafted trees will help you do that. As a rule, with grafted, since you're selecting your sign wood or the wood that you're going to graft onto a seedling, because of nut characteristics, we end up with larger pecans that have better kernel fill. And in many cases, we're looking at paper shell, the ability to crack for the homeowner or even for the commercial people. So those are some of the characteristics that we are reasons that we go with grafted trees. Now, I mentioned some things going on in pecans. This is one of them. Daryl Sparks, who is at the University of Georgia, has been releasing some pecan varieties, and Bird is one of his releases. Now, remember, I just said that a grafted pecan tree may take six to 8 years or so before it starts to bear. Bird has set nuts the third year the tree is in the ground. And the picture on the left-hand side of the screen shows a 3-year-old bird tree. So it's got a substantial crop. It's got a big enough crop to warrant full maintenance for the crop. So early bearing, precocity is one of the things that we're seeing in some new varieties. Another interesting thing, and I think very exciting thing that's come along, is that we're seeing some varieties with some size control. Tom is a new variety that was released by Sparks, and it is being described as being a dwarf-like tree. Again, you've got a smaller tree that's going to be easier to care for. It'll be easier to spray. The light relationships on small trees tend to be better, and growing pecans, just like growing tree fruits or small fruits, is all about capturing sunlight. And a small tree tends to be more efficient at that and have less non-productive area in the inside of the canopy of the tree. So we're putting these trees, or potentially we'll put these trees out at a higher density. And so our early years are going to be higher yields. And of course, we're looking at how they'll maintain that yield potential as they get further and further into their lifespan. This chart came from Texas Pecan Nursery, and I put it in primarily to show the characteristics of pecan, certain varieties of pecan, as far as time of bloom and when is the stigma receptive to pollination. And I might point out, I see now that the chart didn't transfer as good as it should, but this information is online. Texas Pecan Nursery has an online site and has that a correct chart online. It's important to realize, of course, that the calendar dates that they report won't line up with what we see, but the order, the sequence as far as one variety compared to another should be valid. Mentioned pecans have male and female flower parts, and this slide shows it. The catkins are the male flower parts, and that's where the pollen grains are. The catkins actually form on the pecan the year before the crop. So in a given summer, you've got a crop of pecans on the tree, but the catkins, or the pollen for the following year, is being formed in the catkins. The female flower, is indicated out on the tip of the shoot, occurs on current season's growth, on the terminal of the new shoot growth. And so the catkins, or the pollen, is physically separated from the female flower. But again, with pecan, where you need cross-pollination, that's not going to be as big an issue as if it was a self-fertile plant. With pecan, as with many of the nut crops, we depend on the wind for pollination, for movement of those pollen grains around. Insects are kind of incidental, but if we should happen to not have a lot of pecan trees in an area and get a fairly extended rainy period at the time of pollen discharge, we may see some issues with pollination of these blooms because the pollen's being washed out of the air. When we set a pecan block, I would like to see the trees, the pollinator varieties, not over 100 feet or so away from the variety needing pollination. That's going to depend a lot on which side. If it's upwind, you might be able to get by with the pollinator tree a little bit further away from the variety needing cross-pollination, but the closer you are, the better off you're going to be. We mentioned protandry and protogeny, and all that is referring to the time of pollen discharge in relation to the time that the female flowers are receptive. So if you've got a protandrous variety in a given variety, that pollen is probably being discharged before the female flower on that same tree is receptive, which is not a big deal since cross-pollination is pretty much required for pecan production. But it's good to know when you're trying to figure out the orchard, what the characteristics of those different varieties are. And that's listed or should be listed in the nursery description of that variety. I'm going to move away from pecan just a little bit, and I'll be glad to try to entertain any questions on any of these crops as we go along. But I wanted to cover several things, and then if you want to get into them more in depth, then by all means give me a shout, and I look forward to talking with you about it. There are some Hickons out there, and these are pecan hickory crosses. The ones I've seen, I've not been really too impressed with, in that the shells of the nuts tend to be quite thick, and the kernels tend to be relatively small. The kernel fill is not that extensive, but they're out there, and there are some interest in Hickon. And when you look through the literature, you may well find them referenced, and they can be, as indicated on the lower left-hand side of the slide, they can have pretty good big nuts. Here we're looking at a Hickon that's about 3 inches in length. Now, filbert or hazelnut is native to the East. We have them around, and it's got some potential for us. I had some in my backyard in Knoxville for a while because there was a gentleman in Alcoa who was his hobby was messing around with hazelnuts, and he had one that had a nice big nut, and he had also found a second variety that would be pretty consistent in pollinating it, and so we were looking at those. But hazelnut or filbert is one that we can grow relatively easily if we get the right varieties, and we'll hit that in just a minute. But on this slide, you can see the catkins on the left-hand side. You can see the nuts developing on the lower right-hand side. With hazelnuts, the catkins, again, are formed the year before the crop comes in. If we have a relatively warm winter, the catkins can come out very early and be damaged by cold weather. Or if they shed their pollen, they may shed too early too. So it's a kind of a challenge trying to find a good pollinator variety. And in many cases, I recommend having a minimum of 3 varieties, so we have a little bit less of a problem of missing the critical period for pollination entirely. I've grown some hazelnuts right now out at the Plant Science Farm off Alcoa Highway, but we're primarily using those for truffle production. Truffles are mycorrhiza that colonize the roots and will form, and hazelnut is quite often used as a host plant for them. But they'll grow in Tennessee. The challenge is to find a good combination for pollination. And I might point out that when I grew these at my house, it took the squirrels 2 years to find them. But after that second year, I never was able to harvest anymore. The hazelnut is generally not grafted. It's grown on its own roots, and it can be grown as a tree. It can be grown as a shrub. They will root sucker prolifically, and therefore, if you want to grow them as a shrub, you can do that. They'll start to bear their crop fairly young. That is the 3rd year or so. You're quite apt to see blossoms or blooms, the females and the catkins. So they can come into bearing quite quickly. If we plant commercial varieties, then we need to take care to get the right one. So as I said, hazelnuts are native to the eastern half of North America. There are two primary factors limiting hazelnut production. One of them is a disease called eastern filbert blight. And it was a problem in the east and not necessarily out west. It's now a problem out there as well. But fortunately, there are varieties that are resistant to eastern filbert blight. So if a person wants to plant hazelnuts and they're going to buy the trees from nurseries, then they need to look for varieties that do have the resistance. The other factor that limits production is a lack of sufficient cold hardiness. We can see damage either to the woody tissues of the plant, especially in winters where either we get really, really cold or we get a lot of extreme temperature fluctuations over short periods of time. But also, and perhaps more frequently, we'll see cold damage to the catkins that are overwintering on that plant. There are hardy disease-resistant varieties that are fairly tolerant to a fairly wide range of growing conditions. So they can be a good crop to grow for nuts or for a wildlife food source. They don't take up a lot of room. And so it is a possibility for us to grow these over most of Tennessee. This is kind of a review, but actually the catkins on hazelnut, like pecan, are formed in early summer of the previous year, and the female flowers initiated in midsummer. Cross-pollination is primarily accomplished by wind. As I mentioned, hazelnut can be grown as a bush or a tree. Generally with a bush, 8 to 12 feet in height is not unusual, using multiple trunks that come up as root suckers. And you can transplant if you get a root sucker that has gotten roots, and you can separate it from the mother plant and transplant it this time of year. If you choose to grow hazelnut as a tree, you can prune out all the root suckers except for one and develop that into a trunk and look at a little bit taller plant, somewhere in the neighborhood of 14, 16 feet tall, and sort of about the same width. That is, the trees are fairly round in shape. First yield, somewhere around the 4th year, and full yield upwards of 6th to 7th year. So in the nut world, it's a fairly early bearing crop. They like a soil that's pH of about 6.5. Tree life may exceed 30 to 40 years, and that's well, I've not seen a whole lot to dispute that, but you know, that when we put out our truffle planting, I used a mix between hazelnuts and oaks as host plants, with the idea that hazelnut would come in quicker on truffles production, but they also wouldn't last as long. And once they started to crowd, we removed hazelnuts, and the oak trees would then be in production for the truffles and would survive over a longer period of time. So hazelnut is not a real long-lived nut tree, but again, 30 to 40 years is not unreasonable. You can propagate the tree by layering. You can also propagate it by removing a sucker if it's rooted in this time of year. Yields, now we don't have any commercial production that I'm aware of to verify this, but the potential yield is estimated at about a ton to almost a ton and a half of nuts per acre. And you can see on the lower left-hand side of the screen what eastern filbert blight looks like. Again, there are varieties out there that are resistant. A lot of the filbert work is coming out of Oregon now, and the breeders out there are now looking at eastern filbert blight resistance in their crosses. Chestnuts, probably, of course, in Tennessee, we used to have the American chestnut a lot, and the chestnut blight pretty much took it out. I might point out that things are looking promising as far as maybe getting something back in that regard. About 2-3 years ago, it was determined that there was a single gene responsible for the chestnut blight, and they think they have got some things going that may enable us to grow something that's 99.99% American chestnut. But in the meantime, there's several other types of chestnut. The European chestnut, also blight susceptible. The Chinese chestnut is pretty much what we see out there in chestnut production now. The tree is fairly blight resistant. I have seen chestnut blight on the tree, but unlike the American chestnut, where it kills pretty much the above ground part of the tree, a Chinese chestnut may take out a branch, and generally a weakened branch, and that's about it. So if you've got a tree that's fairly open to sunlight, and you do a decent job pruning out some of the lower shaded limbs, you may never see it. So Chinese chestnut is fairly blight resistant. The trees are fairly low and spreading, or they can be upright, but they do produce a good sized nut that's quite sweet and fairly easy to open. So we see a lot of interest in that. The Japanese chestnut is not being grown because it tends to be a small nut, and the nuts are not very high quality from an eating standpoint. Chinkapins, small, sweet nuts, but again, we don't see much interest in commercial production. The up until recently, the American and Chinese hybrids that were developed did show resistance to chestnut blight. They did produce some good size and relatively sweet nuts, but at least earlier in the program, they were very, very similar to the Chinese chestnut, and therefore we didn't see a lot of interest in planting much of that. Things may be changing on that over time, but that's kind of the status the last time I was involved with the trees. So as I said, Chinese chestnut is the dominant chestnut grown now. Different varieties give you different sizes of the nuts, taste, and productivity. They'll bear, seedling trees are later start to bear than our grafted trees. And again, I recommend grafted trees because the trueness to type and the more precocious nature of the tree. But they're considered to be suitable for production in any area that peaches do fairly well. They'll tolerate a soil pH from 5 up to 6.5. I would prefer to see the pH above 6. Definitely at the time of establishment, I'd want it as close to 6.5 as I could get. They don't like poorly drained soils. So again, you want well-drained soils for those trees. The suggested spacing here is about the same as what we used to recommend on peach at 20 by 20. And you might be able to go out with that, but as the trees grow, they can start to crowd. And if so, what we find in many of our nut trees, rather than try to prune to hold them within a confined area, you might be more successful in doing some tree removal and thinning out the planting that way. Chestnut trees, both male and female flowers are on the same tree on current season's growth. They do need cross-pollination, and they are wind pollinated primarily. Seedling trees, is here it says begin to bear 5 to 7 years. Grafted trees about half that time. The eastern black walnut is a fairly common tree. We've had some issues with thousand canker disease, losing some of these trees and lessening the interest in planting these. But the tree itself is recognized for producing high value hardwood products. The nuts have high flavor, but they tend to be hard to hull, hard to shell. It's important. I get calls, people that want to grow nuts are these trees. They want to grow the trees for timber, but they also want good nut production. And I think it's fairly important to point out that optimum nut production and optimum wood production is not going to be very easy, if at all possible, to accomplish in the same planting. The timber tree, you generally plant closer together because you want more upright growth. You don't want as much lateral branching lower down the tree. You want a nice straight trunk. And by planting them closer together, you tend to be able to get that a little bit more. But it's a long-term investment. You know, it's something that you don't do for your children, you do it for your grandchildren, I guess, because it may take upwards of 80 years to produce high-quality timber or veneer from them. If you grow for the fruit, a walnut orchard tree, you're looking at a tree that has a relatively short trunk and spreading branches and a full canopy that's open to permit good sunlight penetration throughout the tree. And so we give them more room, more spacing than you do for a timber tree, and you're going to be treating it for the nut production. As a rule, if you've got a tree that's growing really vigorously, well, first off, it's not necessarily that good for timber, but it's also going to be a late tree to start to bear. So with walnuts growing for the fruit or for the nuts, we're going to manipulate the fertility on those trees a little bit to help control or to encourage fruiting. Mention a wide spacing for good sunlight. Definitely use grafted trees and anticipate production beginning in about 7 years, but it's going to be a few years after that before you hit what we consider to be peak production. We'll see some interest in English walnuts, and usually when people talk about English walnuts, what they're actually referring to is the Carpathian walnut. And the Carpathian walnut is a more cold hardy strain of the English walnut that could be grown further north than English walnut and in climates that may have more variable winters. I'm going to say, though, that I've not seen a lot of these in Tennessee, but I've never seen a tree that was probably 8-10 years old or older that did not have cold injury. So we may be, we may need to be looking at the borders for planting this a little bit more closely. I've not seen a lot of them, but again, cold injury has been an issue. A Carpathian walnut is sort of like we talked about with the Chinese chestnut. You're looking at a tree that's got a fairly rounded, spreading crown. It can get fairly decent size, 40 to 60 feet or so in height, and it can have substantial yields when it gets on up if it's open to sun and if it's well maintained. Some lesser known nuts that are out there, but I very seldom, if ever, see heart nuts. These are every now and then I'll run across one and people see them and they're different enough that they get curious about them. But a heart nut takes about 3 to 5 years to produce nuts if it's grown from seed. Grafted trees again will produce earlier. I don't know where we can get them. They tend to be quite productive once they get on up and start to bear, and can give you a tree maybe somewhere around 50 feet or so in height. Butternuts, we used to have these up in New York where I was raised, but they're similar to walnuts in that they the size of the tree and the nut looks somewhat the same way, but they're a lighter colored nut. They do have a kind of a buttery taste and don't have the tannins that you see in black walnuts or in the English walnut. Don't see a lot of these. Very seldom have I seen them in Tennessee. And then Walnut, which is a cross between butternut and heartnut. I've never seen one of these that I really knew of. So that's something that if you see one, I'd be interested in knowing about it. But all I know about it is what little I've read about them. We'll move away from nut trees and talk a little bit about some other crops. Persimmons are one that we get quite a fair amount of interest. It's interesting. About 4 or 5 years ago in the fall, I rode campus bus over the main campus. I had to go to the bookstore, I guess, but there was a student that had a bag of American persimmons with him, and he was trying to get the girls on the bus to try one of the persimmons, and we got an idea that they weren't exactly as ripe as they ought to be, and therefore would be quite astringent. But and in the time that I saw him, he was not successful in getting anybody to try one of the things. But we grow both American and Asian persimmons in Tennessee, but not necessarily all over the same parts of Tennessee. So a little bit about them. American persimmon is a smaller fruit. Generally, it's closer in size to a plum, where Asian persimmon can get quite big and be about the size of a peach. If we allow the persimmons to get soft, the texture of both the Asian and the American persimmons are fairly similar, and they tend to be fairly sweet fruits. Here they talk about notes of honey, but the texture on you have some non-astringent varieties, especially in the Asian persimmons, and you can therefore eat those when they're firm and not soft ripe. The texture of a firm fruit on a non-astringent cultivar is compared to an apple, or in texture and in flavor, although it tends to be perhaps a little bit sweeter. And this is the Asian persimmon. It's native to Japan, China, Burma, the Himalayas, and Khasi Hills of northern India. You'll see it referred to as Asian or Japanese or Oriental persimmon. So it kind of depends on who you talk to as to what they'll call it. It is the predominant persimmon species grown commercially in the United States. California is the main growing state. Florida is second, and there are some Oriental persimmons grown and marketed out of southeastern part of Texas. This chart shows the production in the latest figures I saw from 2018 to 19, a little over 3,000 acres of Oriental persimmons grown in the U.S., averaging about almost 7 tons per acre. As I mentioned, they're grown commercially, California, Florida, and parts of Texas. This is a list of some of the varieties, and notice that you've got both non-astringent and astringent varieties. So a non-astringent persimmon can be eaten when it's firm, when it's almost crunchy like an apple, whereas the astringent varieties need to hang until they actually get soft to get rid of that astringency that's in the fruit. So again, I'm not going to try to pronounce the names, but this is a fairly extensive list. The Fuyu is one of the more common ones that I see reference to throughout parts of Tennessee. Carol Reese, I might point out, is a whole lot more familiar with Oriental persimmons than I was, because I think her family grew them in Mississippi. If we look at the American persimmon, it's native to the eastern part of North America, and it can be found all the way from southern Connecticut or Long Island on down through Florida. And the green area on the lower left-hand side shows the zone where these things are found, and all the way west out into Oklahoma. So it occupies a fairly big area in the eastern part of the U.S. These are some named varieties of American persimmon. To my knowledge, they are all astringent. There are some varieties that need to be cross-pollinated, but there are some varieties that will set fruit seedlessly or parthenocarpically, and therefore do not need to be pollinated. They grow wild, but generally, if a person is really wanting to have a good eating American persimmon, we would advise them, unless they had a wild one they could try, to purchase named varieties to be sure that they're getting something that is edible. This just shows the different shapes that you might find among different cultivars. Both of these are Oriental persimmons, and were taken in a planting in Florida. But they can be fairly upright with a central leader type of growth, or they can be more of an open spreading tree, similar to the way that we train peaches. Now, as I mentioned this before, but astringent persimmons need to be completely ripe, that is quite soft, before they're palatable. And there's a belief that an American persimmon is not edible until it's gone through a hard frost freeze event. That's not necessarily true, but it is true that they have to be completely ripe and soft, which is going to occur, of course, on up into the fall, before these things are edible. All American cultivars are astringent. Some of the Asian varieties are astringent, some are non-astringent. The non-astringent varieties, they're firm when they're ripe, they're edible when they're firm. You can either eat them at that time or leave them until they soften, and they'll be good both ways. And this just lists three of the more common ones as far as astringency grown in the US, and while Fuyu is the most popular non-astringent grown in Japan. There are, well, I think, yeah. As far as the uses for persimmons, for the non-astringent varieties, they're good fresh eaten, whether they're firm or soft. They can be sliced when firm, as added to salads for color or flavor, and they can be eaten soft as is, or they can actually make ice cream or simulate ice cream out of them and make a nice dessert. Persimmons are processed into a lot of baked goods, custards, ice creams, preserves, and puddings. And there's also some interest in drying persimmons as a value-added product. There are relatively few natural pests for persimmons, and therefore, if somebody was looking at a crop to try to grow organically, persimmons may be something that they consider. The trees tend to be drought tolerant. However, realize that irrigation is kind of an insurance policy. If you have irrigation and you use it correctly, you can get larger fruit, and you get higher yields, and you can get more consistent yields out of the tree. Persimmons are kind of interesting in that they don't have chilling requirements. That is, they don't need many hours of cold during the winter to satisfy the needs that will allow them to break dormancy and grow normally in the spring of the year. You would think that the fact that they don't need chilling, or that they have a very low chill requirement, would mean that they're very prone to cold injury. However, that's not necessarily the case. The trees tend to be relatively cold tolerant. Now, they can be damaged, but here the literature states that American persimmon can survive temperatures as low as 20, 25 degrees below zero, whereas the Asian varieties may be injured at temperatures around 10. That's true, but what we see in Tennessee in fruit crops is that a lot of our cold damage occurs well above what's considered a critical temperature for damage. And the reason for that is we may have a fairly warm spell for several days midwinter, and then within a very short period of time, 24, 20 to 36 hours, we can see a radical temperature change, and that plant cannot necessarily adapt to that change, and we'll see our cold damage even though temperatures never got down to what we consider to be the critical point. The Asian persimmons are not going to be well adapted to all parts of Tennessee like the American would be. Yields on persimmons tend to fluctuate from year to year, especially when the trees are not as well cared for. If they're not pruned or if the crop is not thinned on a heavy year, then you're going to see some alternate bearing tendencies develop. American persimmon trees produce flowers that maybe on a tree you may see male or female, but not both flowers. And you need to have both male and female trees for fruiting to occur where you don't set fruit parthenocarpically, that is without pollination. Asian persimmons, oriental persimmons, may produce male, female, or perfect flowers all on the same plant. And so they're quite different. If you've got a perfect flower, you may not need cross-pollination to set the fruit. Some Asian persimmon varieties or cultivars will set fruit without pollination. And so seedless persimmons are possible. And parthenocarpy is what we call when we set fruit without pollination. As a rule, but not always, as a rule, the seedless fruits may not be as big as the seeded. But the seedlessness is in terms of the consumer, a fairly desirable trait. Realize that American and Asian persimmon trees will not cross-pollinate each other. So we'll step over into pawpaw just a bit. Pawpaw is known by a lot of things. I've seen it referred to as the poor man's banana because the fruit, if you use your imagination, might look a little bit like that, but it also tastes like that. Pawpaw is actually related to tropical fruit. They look like mangoes, they taste like banana, but pawpaws are native to most of the eastern part of the United States and actually parts of Canada. And they're rated as being adaptable for plant hardiness zones 5 to 8 for the USDA zones. So pawpaw trees tend to be fairly hardy, they're relatively pest-free, and they're tolerant to shade. In fact, early in their life, a young pawpaw may be better off grown in a relatively light to moderate shade. However, as they get older and you get into fruiting, then shade becomes less desirable. It's interesting that Kentucky State University has done a lot of work on pawpaw production over the years. Kirk Pomper is the lead on that project up there, and he's got a lot of information on pawpaws in our area. And Kentucky State is a repository for pawpaw for the country. Their breeding efforts at Kentucky State and with the efforts they have with Cornell and several other universities are directed at producing varieties that have yellow to orange flesh in the fruit, large fruit that is 10 ounces or larger, and also fruit with relatively small and few seeds. Uniformity in fruit shape is something that they'd like to get. And also, it's not uncommon to see a lot of dark and black spotting on the fruit of pawpaw. And those external blemishes, of course, take away from the attractiveness and potential marketability. And so they're looking at trying to develop varieties that have fewer of those blemishes. They want a mild, sweet flesh, and they want something that does not have an unpleasant aftertaste. And so there are some varieties out there. You can also find them growing wild in the borders of woodlands and so on. A lot of times the wild ones have a lot of problems in that the fruit is not that good, and it may not be that productive. And so from a production standpoint, again, name varieties are suggested. Pawpaws like moist, fertile, well-drained soils, a pH somewhere in the 5.5 to 6.5 range. Here, say, as although the tree is shade tolerant, the best crops are produced in full sun. So starting that young tree off with some shade, but realize that as it gets on up in the fruiting, full sun is going to be best. A pawpaw tree can grow upwards of 12 to 25 feet in height, they'll be taller than the will wide, talking about spacing trees anywhere from 8 to 15 feet apart in a commercial planting. Pawpaw blooms in the spring, but it blooms after apples, after peaches, after pears, and therefore the incidence of frost on pawpaw is not as great as it is with those other fruits. However, it still can be a problem. And so when we talk about planting pawpaws, site selection, elevation, possibly a north facing slope, someplace that is going to give you some natural frost protection is an important factor. If you plant grafted trees, of course, you're going to be able to eliminate fruit variability that you would get with seedlings. And you'll also see the tree bearing earlier, 3 to 4 years, as opposed to 5 to 7 year period for ungrafted. The flowers on pawpaw are not the most pleasant thing to smell, and but they are insect pollinated, and flies and beetles are recognized as perhaps the most effective or most common pollinizers. You need to harvest fruit when it's ripe. Pawpaw will not ripen when it's pulled early off the tree, but unfortunately, when a pawpaw is ripe, it's a very delicate fruit, and therefore it's not going to be transported any distance at all. So if you grow pawpaw for your own use, you're in pretty good shape. If you want to market it, look at a local market where you can, you don't have to transport the fruit very far, and realize that a pawpaw just won't tolerate much of abuse once it's in the harvest stage. The lower part of this slide shows 2 suggestive varieties that were developed by Kentucky State University. Atwood is is older than Benson, but again, these are superior varieties, and realize that they were developed just a little bit further north, and therefore they should be adapted to most all parts of Tennessee. Okay, next thing we'll look at is pomegranate. I might start off by saying that this is the one that I would have the least confidence in being successful in Tennessee out of what we've already talked about. It's not that cold tolerant, but a pomegranate is a fairly dense, bushy, shrubbed, multi-stemmed. It's a deciduous plant, therefore it loses its leaves every year. It can be trained either as a shrub or as a small tree, and growing about 10 to 12 feet in height. The branches on pawpaw are thorny, and therefore it's not necessarily the nicest plant to work with. The leaves are glossy and dark green. They're quite attractive. And the fruits, if they bear fruit, can be highly colored and have a lot of juicy seeds, and they're in high demand. So with pawpaw blooming with pomegranate blooming occurs in spring and early summer. The flowers tend to be anywhere from orange to red. And it's interesting in that the different shapes of flower will tell you a little bit about it. A bell-shaped flower will be a female flower, whereas a vase-shaped flower is hermaphroditic. It's sterile. The edible portion of the fruit is called the aril. And in the upper right-hand side, it shows the inside of a pomegranate. There are hundreds of seeds in there, surrounded by juicy pigments, and each one of these are contained in the seed coat, which may be soft or it may be hard. The juice can be anywhere from light pink to dark red, or in some cases, they may have a yellow cast or be clear. It varies again among the cultivar. And they also can be, the juice can be very acidic or ranging up to very sweet. The rind of the fruit is, and we can see it here, is usually smooth and leathery, but it can be yellow, orange, or red. Now, pomegranates are rated as being hardy down to about 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and therefore, you know, as I mentioned before, it's not that universally adapted to the conditions we see in Tennessee. There are some types that are a little bit hardier, but they're only rated down to about, well, the mid single digits, somewhere around 7 degrees. Hard-seeded cultivars tend to be more cold hardy than soft-seeded varieties, so that'll give you a little bit of a hint if you look at different fruits. Most pomegranate cultivars do not require chill hours. They're so winter injury can be a constant threat. They don't go fully dormant like we're used to with other crops. They do tend to be very heat tolerant, and I think very is an understatement here. They perform best at temperatures above 85 degrees for about a 120-day period. So they do tolerate hot weather very well. The trees are rated as being quite drought tolerant, but it's important if you're growing the crop for the fruit, and you want, especially if you're going to be selling the fruit, you want to have good sized fruit. You want to have a regular crop, and irrigation is going to be the way to approach or to accomplish those challenges. Pomegranates grow best on deep, loamy soils, but they can and do grow fairly well on sandy and some of the clayey soils. So they're quite adaptable. pH, you'll see pomegranates listed as liking alkaline soils, but the range that they'll do well in is about 5.5 up to 7.2. They do need well-drained soils. Phytophthora can be a problem. Raised beds are considered because it'll lessen Phytophthora issues. They do need full sun. Here, they're saying at least 6 hours of full sun per day to grow that crop out and to mature it well. And of course, frost can be an issue, and good air drainage in the site that you select is going to be important for frost and for disease protection. If you put out pomegranates, the spacing recommended is somewhere around 18 by 18, or figures out to be about 134 trees per acre, and look for the first harvest about the third year. But it's not uncommon for that first harvest year for the fruit to be fairly small and for it to be late to mature and possibly drop off the tree before it reaches maturity. Full production is going to be recognized somewhere around the 5th to 6th year. So look at maybe the 4th year as the first year that plant may have a crop and actually hold that crop to maturity. The blossoms are self-fruitful, so cross-pollination is not a concern. Insects and hummingbirds are ranked as being the primary pollination vectors. Blooming can occur over a long period of time. And this, the information, part of the information I used came out of Georgia, but they'll see blooming beginning in April and continuing either relatively uniformly all the way up into June, or they may have several flushes of blooms over that April to June time period. The earlier bloom produces larger fruit, which is, I guess you would expect that a little bit more time to grow on the tree. The two types of blooms on the tree, we've mentioned the hermaphroditic blooms, or fruit-bearing flowers, can be identified by their shape. And I think this is reversed from what I had before, and I apologize for that. The hermaphroditic flowers have a narrow V shape of them, and the male flowers are more the rounded base. That's pretty much all I had on these crops. It was, well, there's not a lot in the literature for commercial production. I'll be glad to try to entertain any questions that you might have. So I'll just stop sharing on that.
Thank you, Dr. Lockwood. We'll open it up for any questions. I don't see anything in the chat right now, but if you got anything, if you want to unmute and ask a question, just fire away.
Dr. Lockwood, would we be able to get your slides per chance?
Yeah, but I can make those available, but Troy, you said these copies of these presentations will be out there too, right?
Yes, sir. If you'll send them to me, that'd be great. If you don't mind, and we'll try to make that happen. Thanks, Jacob, for that though. Yes, sir.
Thank you. That'd be great. I learned a lot today, but I'm afraid I might forget it. So it'd be good if I had a hard copy too.
Yeah, we'll do that.
I'm with you, Jacob. There's a lot of things in there. I appreciate that. Other questions from anyone?
I might point out in regards to pest control on pecan, we can go back to that. I mentioned scab resistance. Scab is probably the worst disease we encounter in pecan, and varietal selection is going to be important in that regard. Many of the insect problems that we see in pecan production for the homeowner can be addressed without actually having to spray the trees. There are some things like, well, we have say a twig girdler that will feed around on a shoot, and that shoot will break off and drop to the ground. The eggs for the girdler are in the part of the shoot that hits the ground. And so if you see some twigs breaking off the tree and look at the surface where they broke, if it's a fairly smooth cut, you could suspect, say, a twig girdler. There was a reason for that. If you pick those up, bag them up, throw them in the trash, you've interrupted that life cycle. So you can actually lessen the incidence of that twig girdler by collecting those prunings. We do have a problem with weevil on the nuts. We do on chestnuts as well. And a lot of times if you harvest a pecan and you look at the nut and see a little hole in the that's the exit hole where the weevil had been inside feeding and then has exited the nut. We try, and the weevil overwinters generally in the soil underneath the tree. So the ways you can control it, when they come up in the spring, we may be able to intercept them and lessen their ability to get back up into the tree. Ground management under the tree is important. If you've got a fairly, say you mow the ground underneath the tree, mow it fairly uniformly, fairly close, as a rule, when the weevil emerges and when it goes up in the tree, it'll go up the trunk of the tree. And so you may be able to put a sticky band around the tree and intercept the weevil as it goes up. However, if you've got long grass or weeds underneath the tree, they'll climb up to that stalk of that weed, and then they'll fly from there up into the tree. So ground management and then using trapping on the trunk is a way to lessen the weevil. If you have trees that are already infested with weevil, when the nuts hit the ground in the fall of the year, pick them up fairly frequently, like 2-3 times a week at least, and put those nuts in a bucket or something that if the weevil emerges from the nut, they can't crawl out of that container and get back to the ground. It'll take several years to lower the population, but it can be done, and it can be done without the use of pesticides. So there's several things you can do as a homeowner that are effective to control many of the insect problems we see.
Dr. Lockwood, could you speak to using zinc as a fertilizer on pecan trees? I get that question a lot in the springtime.
Zinc, okay, yeah, it's we did some work on that in Georgia, and it for some reason people get real nervous and convinced that they've got to put zinc down, and part of that I think is encouraged by some of the fertilizer companies. But what we never saw a zinc deficiency when I was working pecan nutrition, but by putting down a lot of zinc, more than we needed, we created iron problems in the tree. What I generally tell people, if they've just got to use zinc, I mean, they're going to do it. About a pound or maybe 2 pounds, if it's a big tree, of zinc sulfate broadcast on the ground underneath the canopy of the tree in the spring of the year should be enough to take care of any zinc problems that the tree might have, and yet not so much that it'll create other problems. And so zinc sulfate would be the material of choice as a ground application. But again, relatively low rates, a pound to not over 2 pounds a year.
Thank you.
Now, pecans, maybe more so than all the other nut crops, are prone to alternate bearing. And part of that's due to the high oil content of the pecan kernel and the fact that it builds that oil late in its development. And it pretty much exhausts the tree in doing so. If the canopy of the tree, if the foliage of the tree is not healthy or extensive, then you may see some alternate bearing in the pecan. So you get a big crop this year, you get virtually no crop next year, and then the third year you may be back into a big crop. We can lessen the severity of alternate bearing through cultural practices. And what I look at on a pecan is 8 to 10 inches of shoot growth on the main branches is an indicator of a tree that's got enough leaves to take care of the needs of the tree and the nut crop. So if you're not seeing that much growth, a little bit higher rates of nitrogen would be recommended. But if you're seeing a lot more than that, then you could back off on nitrogen rate. You'll always have alternate bearing, but the severity of it can be reduced through good cultural practices.
Dr. Lockwood, this is Chris. This is good stuff. Thank you so much. We always get a lot of questions about pecan phylloxera here in Shelby County. So what is the best way to control this insect pest?
Unfortunately, Chris, there's not a real good control for the homeowner. Phylloxera is an insect that we don't seem to be able to control without spraying. And what the last recommendations I saw for the homeowner probably was going to be using malathion as the insecticide, and the first application will be somewhere in right after bud break. And then if you had serious problems on the tree the previous year, a second application about a couple weeks later. Spray as much of the tree as you can. It'll definitely help it. But it's one of the things that chemical control is, to my knowledge, the only answer we have for it now. Usually phylloxera is not bad enough to warrant control, but I know over the years that I've been here, your area, Chris, has always been where I hear phylloxera is there, and it's there quite well, heavy populations.
Yeah, we get a call about that every year. We should have.
Yeah, because it can of course give you galls on the leaves. It can give you galls on the nuts, and they can be a problem. They can definitely build up to be a problem. But that, to right now, that's about all I know to do with it. And because of the homeowner, because of the size of the tree, most homeowners cannot spray those trees, or at least in their entirety. As much of the tree as they can spray, it'll help. Or if they need to, they may need to contact a lawn maintenance operation that has the ability to actually spray those big trees.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions out there for Dr. Lockwood while we got him cornered for just a little bit? All right. If not, again, thank you for being on today. Thank you for your time. Dr. Lockwood, thank you, as always. And if we give you a round of applause, we'd do that somehow. Clap our hands down here or something, but thank you for your time and again, your willingness to help us on these Zooms that we've been doing for the specialty crops. To those in attendance, I will send just a brief evaluation link. If you don't mind, it won't take you but a minute or two to fill that out. That would be helpful for me. And again, once we have this recording in, we get everything done, I'll let you know where we place all 4 of them. I'd probably be on our specialty crop section on CPA website, but I'll let you know for sure where that will be and hopefully get that soon to you so you can look at any of the 4 sessions that we have completed, and I'll get you credit in super. I think I've gotten everybody's name that's been on the call today, so you get credit in super for being on here for the training as well. So if nothing else, thank you all. Have a good rest of your Thursday. And again, thanks for being with us. Thank you, Dr. Lockwood.
Thank you.
Dr. Lockwood, this is Lee Sam. Just hang on just a minute. I have a question for planting at Lockwood.